For tuning in for my talk today. My name is Claudette Moore, and I'm going to be talking about my 2014 trip to South Africa. While we'd rather be planning the next trip, it was actually pretty fun to revisit this trip. So it was a nice trip down memory lane and review some pictures. Like B said, I recently retired from USGS, and I've had kind of a split career between science education and science in the natural resources fields, mostly with the National Park Service and the Forest Service, and then mostly recently with the GS. My husband and I moved down here from Alaska about 8 years, almost 8 years ago now. So it was a big change, but we've been enjoying it so far, although this is our least favorite time of year when it gets really hot here. I've enjoyed getting involved with Eureka and was sort of looking forward to some of the camps this summer, but so much stuff got canceled, and I'm a little bit more hesitant right now until we kind of know what's going on more with this virus transmission. So, but that's, yeah, a little bit about me. And I'm gonna go ahead and start by saying this was actually my second trip to Africa. I was fortunate enough to spend a semester in Kenya my senior year in college with the School for Field Studies program. It's a program that does on-site learning, mostly internationally, with and focuses on resource issues and local cultures. So it's a really powerful program. My interest in traveling to South Africa was also piqued while I was in college, because in my zoology class, I happened to learn that there was a colony of penguins in South Africa. And I thought, I'm probably never going to get to Antarctica, but I could probably get to South Africa. So it's always been something that I was interested in. So we finally made it happen in 2014. Okay, now what? Oh, okay. So once we decided we were going to go, South Africa is a huge country. My husband and I sort of enjoy going to fewer places and spending more days in an area to kind of get to know it, and we get to stay at the same place, so we're not moving every day, which is nice. This trip we did not do as a tour. We planned it totally on our own. So the first thing we did was spend a month probably just reading about the country, where to go, what to do, what kinds of things we could do. I have two friends who are from South Africa who live up in Washington, and they gave me lots of good advice and let me know that traveling there would not be a problem for us, you know, if we took basic precautions. So we were, you know, pretty excited to make it happen. We finally decided to fly into Johannesburg and spend our time in the Mpumalanga province here. Can you see my pointer as I'm pointing?
Yes.
Okay, so this is the main province here that we spent our time in. Initially, we flew in here and traveled east up into this area, which isn't shown on this map, but there's a huge escarpment that comes along here that's called the Drakensberg Escarpment that goes all the way kind of along the eastern edge of the country. So we went up in that area, and then in this area here is where Kruger National Park is, and it's the holy grail of wildlife viewing. So that was definitely on our list. From there, we drove south, kind of along here and staying along the escarpment, and then visited a series of national parks, which is based along the Drakensberg Escarpment down in the KwaZulu-Natal province. So we spent some time here. Then we flew back up to Johannesburg and flew down to Cape Town and rented another car, and then spent a week in the Cape Town and surrounding areas. So my talk is going to be about those three areas that we decided to do, and we'll just get started from there. So the first place we drove to was along the Drakensberg. It's called the Panorama Drive and the Blyde River Canyon. So the Drakensberg Escarpment divides the province into a western high altitude area, which is forests and high plains grasslands, and then the eastern lowland, which is very warm and a savanna habitat. That area is about 6,500 feet and drops off into these beautiful valleys, and includes remnants of the Afro-montane forest, which was the endemic forest at those higher elevations. Most of that forest type is gone at this point. It's all been logged, and a lot of this area is now forest plantations. So it's managed for forest harvest. The panoramic loop is this area that drives around here, and it's about 100 miles. And along it is a beautiful drive that highlights the geologic and the geologic features and historic places. And it's considered one of the best drives in South Africa. It's really, really spectacular. It's known for its waterfalls, potholes, and spectacular views along the escarpment. So as long as it's not raining, you get a pretty beautiful drive that you get to participate in. So we drove up there and stayed in a place for a few nights to take in the area. So the first place we visited was the Lisbon Waterfalls. The Lisbon Waterfalls is the highest falls in the province. And again, part of the escarpment, you just see all these beautiful cuts through the escarpment and just really spectacular waterfalls. There's a whole series of them all through here, and they're just really, really beautiful. So that's all part of the drive. The next one that we visited was the Porksluck potholes. And this is a series of potholes that was just developed through erosion. It's at the head of where the Truer and the Blyde rivers meet, and based on just the erosional patterns through that limestone rock, it's just created this whole series of potholes. And the Bork's pothole is named after Bork, who was one of the miners that came through the area. A lot of the features that are up here are named after miners that came from different countries. This is an area along the Borksluck trailhead. There's a whole series of trails and bridges that crosses the river where you can get down close and be up above them. It's a really, again, a super spectacular area to visit. Next along the route is the three rondavels. This is three basically little erosional hillsides, and rondavels are named after the small grass huts of the traditional villagers that were in this area. And these were formed by erosion, so the limestone was eroded, and it basically left the harder quartz behind, which was then, eventually vegetated. And these peaks are also named after one of the three wives of one of the prominent chiefs that was in this area. So there's a lot of mythology and history in these areas as well. We didn't get the super beautiful sunny day. If you look up the three rondavels, you'll see, some spectacular sunny pictures where they are really prominent, but we had kind of a cloudy day. But when you're traveling to these areas, you take the weather that you get, and but it was still really a beautiful area. Next was along the route, the panoramic route, was God's Window. And basically it's just a view looking, 700 to 800 feet down in the valley. And what you see is a lot of the forestation processes that are going on. So, the forests have been harvested at different times and are under different reforestation regimes. This is a trail that you could walk along the God's Window, along the escarpment there. So the vegetation in South Africa, I mean, my husband and I are pretty good at botany, but I'll tell you, when you get to the Southern Hemisphere and in these sort of tropical zones, the vegetation becomes really overwhelming really fast. All different plant families that we've just never heard of. So it was really interesting to look at. And then this is another view. You can see these areas up here. These are more remnant pieces of some of that Afro-montane forest that are still intact, but mostly you can just see down here where these monocultures of forests that are harvested. There is some mining, but mostly it's agriculture now and forestry in these areas. Next, we drove over to Kruger National Park. So Kruger was established in 1926, and it was an expansion of an area called the Sabi Game Reserve that was established by, at the time, President Kruger, who wanted to preserve the large game populations because they were being over-harvested even back then. And there was also a lot of culling because there was a lot of agriculture happening in that area. So as you can imagine, having large animals roam through your fields, it makes it harder to farm. So in 1926, it was expanded to be called Kruger National Park. And it was originally fenced all the way around the park. And that was to prevent poaching, obviously, but also to prevent the animals from getting out onto the farmland and prevent, you know, more unnecessarily taking of the wildlife. But in 2002, it became part of what's called the Greater Limpopo Transfrontier Park, which was a peace preserve that includes borders parks in Mozambique and Zimbabwe. And it's recognized as by UNESCO for its cultural, biological, and ecological significance. So what they did was they took down all the fencing at that time, which allowed the animals to have a much larger range with other national park areas in those boundary areas. But what that's done is also open it up to more poaching in those countries where the game management isn't as good. So it's kind of a double-edged sword. It's good to have that recognition of, you know, land protection and management protection, but it's a constant battle with poaching. And, you know, we saw the rangers, and if you've ever read anything about the African game rangers, you know, they're fighting a huge losing battle. They don't have a lot of support. They're doing what they can. It's a lonely, dangerous job for those individuals. But, you know, that's kind of all part of visiting the African continent. One of the things, of course, the park has full accommodations. It's just like going to a Yellowstone or, you know, one of our big parks here. You can stay in really fancy hotels. You can camp. We stayed in like a hut, like sort of a cabin, which was beautiful. We moved to a couple of different locations based on where we were going. It's got a great extensive road system for self-touring. So the brown lines that you can see on this map, those are the paved roads through the park. But in addition to that, there's a whole extensive network of dirt roads. And, you know, we just had a simple two-wheel drive vehicle and we were able to drive everywhere. You get a huge map, like a booklet when you come into the park, and you know, we just mapped out our days to figure out where would be the best places that we wanted to go. A lot of the animals will congregate around the river areas, so those were high priorities for us. And so it would sort of drive where we were going to go on any individual day. It's one of the most diverse wildlife parks in Africa, with 147 mammal and 517 bird species. So there's pretty much something for everything. And of course, everyone. There's a lot of reptiles. It was a pretty magical place. And my husband had not been to Africa before, so he was really wowed. And although I had been there, you know, it's hard not to be wowed by the amount of wildlife and how close you can get to them. Of course, you know, you hear about the big five, which are, you know, sort of the crown jewels of the safari that you want to see. But before we get to that, I'm going to talk about a lot of the ungulate species that we saw. Ungulates, as you probably know, are the hoofed animals, and you've got your single-toed like zebras and horses, and your even-toed, which are cows, impala, a lot of the other species that you're used to. So impala was one of the first ones that we came upon. They're herding animals. They're both grazers and browsers, and you know, you probably know grazers are the ones that mostly eat grass, and browsers are the ones that eat a little bit of everything. You know, they eat the browse vegetation, the leaves, the fruits. And so, you know, these ungulates vary. Impala can do both, but their preference is to graze. Whoops. So got ahead of myself. So, you know, you could get fairly close in the car, but also obviously these are all taken with a telephoto. What's really interesting is you can drive, the animals are all super used to your vehicles, but if you get out of your car, they will flee. You're not allowed to get out of your car. My husband did because he wanted to chase a butterfly, and the animals just all took off. It was pretty entertaining. Anyway, this is a great picture, I thought, of just them just sort of hanging out. And one thing I will say as we go through, a good time to visit places like Kruger tend to be either in the spring or the fall when it's not totally leafed out, because a lot of the park can be very scrubby vegetation. If it's totally leafed out, it's much, much harder to see the animals. And in the summer, just like here, the animals aren't nearly as active. And so we were there in the spring, and it wasn't super hot, and there wasn't a ton of vegetation on the trees, so you really could see a lot of the animals as you pass by. The next were greater kudu. The females don't have horns, but the males do. And again, you can see if it's super leafed out how hard it would be to see a lot of these animals. There's two species of kudu, the greater and the lesser. The lesser are much smaller. These are pretty good size animals. They're probably close to the size of a moose. They're very big. They tend to travel more solitarily. They're not herd animals like the impala and some of the other ungulate species. The next one is giraffes, one of my personal favorites. I did my senior thesis on giraffe ecology. And interestingly enough, it sort of brings up a topic as I was researching this. Actually, the term giraffe is derived from an Arabic word, which means fast walker. But the other thing that I came across as I was, sort of putting this all together is it sort of brings up the discussion of lumpers versus splitters. And if you folks are birders or vegetation people, you've probably heard that term. We have so much capability now with studying genetics, and, all of these animals have been studied in detail. Some scientists believe that giraffes are one species with 9 subspecies. And some scientists believe that they are 8, there's just 8 species. So depending on if you're a lumper or splitter, certainly what DNA analysis has done has made the distinction between individual species versus subspecies a lot more challenging to discern. And so that's kind of an ongoing subject for a lot of ecologists. And but it's kind of interesting to realize that it's being applied to all these animal species that have been studied over time. But the giraffes are pretty magnificent. I think they're one of my favorites. Next is the blue wildebeest, another ungulate species. They tend to travel in large herds, and if you've ever been up around the Serengeti, they're one of the ones that have huge migrations across the Serengeti. Down here in southern Africa, they are more resident populations, and they don't have those big migrations, but they do travel in herds, and their herds, if they get going, you do not want to be in their way. I love getting headshots of animals. So you can see this guy's just about to take a big bite of grass. One thing about the wildebeest, they tend to travel with the zebra populations. And part of the reason is because the zebras they're also grazers, but they eat the top of the grass, which is less nutritious. And so they kind of mow that off. And then that leaves sort of those newer shoots that have higher nutritional value that the wildebeest really like. And so they can come down and get those nice fresh grass shoots. In addition to being early spring, it had been very dry before we got there. So it wasn't as green as locals had, liked it to be at that time of year. So the zebra species that we saw, what's called the Burchell zebra, and they also travel in small herds, and they are a subspecies of the plain zebra. So they're found mostly in South Africa and Southern Africa. There's 3 species, and the gravies and the montane zebras are considered more vulnerable. The plain zebra is in really good shape. The montane species tend to be more endangered because those areas have been logged, and a lot of the habitat is not as intact as some of these savanna grasslands are. But these guys are always kind of fun to see as well. Next is the hippopotamus. Hippopotamus you generally see in water, so they look something like this as you come across them. You're seeing a lot of eyes. Hippopotamus are extremely dangerous when they're in the water because as big as they are, they can be very mobile. And they also, the wildebeest, The hippopotamus cause a lot of, what I want to say, deaths, you know, to humans because, I don't know, people want to cross the river and come into contact with them or whatever. So they're considered very dangerous. But however, when they're on land and grazing, because they're so big, they might charge you and you certainly don't want to antagonize them, but they're considered less dangerous when they're on land because they can't move as fast as they can when they're in the water. You know, they're just a lot more buoyant. They fight a lot. So you can see this guy is pretty scarred up. So it kind of lets you know that they, you know, they don't go through the world quietly. They can be extremely ferocious. Lots and lots of birds, and I'm sure there's a lot of birders out there. We did see a lot of birds. We saw quite a few hornbills. This is the gray hornbill. Whoops. This is one of the stork species. This is the southern yellow-billed hornbill, and this is the European bee-eater. The bee-eater, as it turns out, is migratory from the European countries, and it migrates to the mid part of the African continent to kind of the tropical areas there. But the bee-eater populations down in South Africa are actually considered resident populations. So they don't have those big migration patterns that you see up further in Africa. Lots of beautiful, beautiful birds though. So getting on to the big five. So, you know, I mean, sadly, I mean, part of the big five you want to see in going to Kruger, but they're also ones that are often hunted as well. So that's the African lion, the African leopard, the elephant, the Cape buffalo, and the rhino. So we were out, you know, to see the big five. The elephants are pretty easy to see. They tend to travel in large groups. Super amazing to watch. They're so smart. Again, you can see hard to photograph in, you know, sort of perfect picture ways because there's a lot of shrubs and vegetation, but you can see the little tykes following mom. Another beautiful picture. When I was in Kenya, one of the parks that we went to was a park there where there was a woman who was studying elephant populations. And one of the ways that they learned to distinguish individuals is by looking at the venation patterns in elephant ears and the scarring. So like anything else that you come to study a long time, they got to know their elephants really well. And about the time that I was there in the mid 80s, they were also discovering, you know, elephants are, as you know, we all know, super, super intelligent animals, but they really struggled for a long time trying to understand how they communicated because they don't make a lot of sounds that we hear. In the mid 80s, about the time that I was in Kenya, they were starting to work with scientists who studied whale sounds. And by using the recorder that could record sound waves that we could not hear, they discovered that elephants do indeed have an extensive and elaborate communication patterns. We just don't hear them because they're at the lower end of the sound wave range that's well out of our ability to hear. But, you know, through technology and so forth, they were able to get them compressed into a way that we could hear them, and since have learned that elephants have an amazing communication strategy among their groups. So they've, you know, been following them for quite a while. And the other thing you see, this guy has tusks, but a lot of elephants now down there, what they do is they dart them and they actually cut their tusks off to prevent poaching. So sometimes you can go into places and you'll see that their tusks have been cut off, and that's really just for their own protection to kind of allow them to live longer. In these parks, they allow them to have the tusks to the extent that they can, but there is poaching. So you will see elephants that have their tusks cut for that reason. Then of course you've got the lions, also, you know, magnificent creatures. And they can be, you know, obviously they prey on a lot of the ungulate species, mostly the, you know, the mid to smaller ones that are easier to catch. But the males will hunt solo. They'll go after the Cape buffalo. They'll go after giraffe. They'll go after the wildebeest, you know, the larger ones that you wouldn't think would be easy to take down. but they do. This is a picture of a mom with her little cubs there. Again, a tough shot to get, but it gives you the idea of what it's like when you're viewing these animals, you know, through your car and through your binoculars and stuff. We did see quite a few lions, and they were just always really spectacular. One of the things we learned about when we were there is Kruger initially had developed a lot of artificial water sources to help the animals in drier years create, you know, give them a water source. But what they discovered was it was like almost too easy for the lions, because these ungulates would just, you know, go to these large water sources, these impoundments essentially, and just be a free-for-all for the lions. So in order to make it kind of a little bit more natural for them, they have no longer support those impoundments. They've just kind of let them dry up and revegetate over years. But I thought that was kind of interesting that, you know, they're trying to maintain these landscapes as naturally as possible. Most of the national parks in Kruger that we learned about, you know, they're not like our parks here where there was already an infrastructure of wildlife. A lot of this wildlife had to be carefully reintroduced, and the populations are really managed based on the size and so forth. So it's a little bit different strategy than we have here. And lions, because they're one of the big five, there's also a lot of lion farms where the animals are raised simply to be game hunted, which, you know, depending on how you feel about that is it was hard for us, because it's hard to believe that you would just raise an animal just to be shot and mounted on your wall. But, you know, if that's your thing, you know. But anyway, as we were driving into our accommodations for the evening, we came across a pair of male lions, young male lions, and one was down. It's really hard to see, but this is actually a hippo carcass. A hippo had died and was wedged. I mean, this block here is, you know, the post that's sort of the guard for the road. I mean, our car is like right next to this guy. So as you can imagine, there was a huge car backup. And this guy was feeding, you know, having his fill on this hippo carcass. It was super hard to get at it because their outer skin is so tough. It was really hard for these lions to try to get into where the meaty areas was. So that guy was busy, and this guy was just waiting his turn, and he was literally right outside our window. So, you know, we snapped tons and tons of pictures, as did all the cars lining up along our way. And finally, this guy got his chance to, you know, the one male lion down there got out of the way, and this guy got his chance to get down and get in on the free food down there. So it was really, really interesting because, you know, it was starting, the sun was going down, so it was starting to get dark, but we thought we would see, you know, the carcass in the morning and we would check it out. And when we left our place the next morning, the hippo had dislodged, and so it had already floated downstream. So they got what they could and had to move on to the next meal. This is the African buffalo, and they are huge creatures. Definitely don't want to mess with them. And they're also grazers. You see a lot of them down there, and they had you know, they had quite a few young with them. They weren't super small, so they must be born pretty early in the spring. But also large numbers of those that we saw as we were traveling. We did not see the leopard. That would be really the holy grail. They are pretty endangered down there, but we did come across a mom and some cheetah cubs, and we kind of substituted cheetahs for leopards, and we were fine with that. Super nice to be able to drive by and see these guys just kind of chilling under a tree as we were driving by. And, you know, they're kind of like cats at home. If they're not hunting, they're just kind of chilling. So it was really neat and to see. And just like national parks here, we discovered this because as we were driving down the road, you could see all the cars pulled over. We couldn't see what they were looking at right away, but you know, as soon as you get closer and you pull the binos out, you're like, oh, okay, that's worth a stop and some pictures and some time. So, you know, you just sort of drive around and you see what you see, and you look for where other people are congregated. They did have some areas where we could get out of the vehicles and have lunch and so forth, so that was nice. But for the most part, you're in your car, so all these pictures are taken from our vehicle with a telephoto lens of some sort. I just want to talk a little bit about the vegetation. This is the baobab tree, which is, you know, one of the more famous known trees from the African vegetation. They're just really spectacular, beautiful trees. They're pretty endangered. You don't see a lot of them. This is kind of a big granddaddy, which was a beautiful tree to be able to see. A lot of Kruger is in one of the main habitats is the river plains. And so this is the Lobato River. This is one of the areas where you could see a lot of the animals down by the river. And this is the Olifants, another river that traveled through. So we spent a lot of time, you know, doing our trips by the river because that's where you see a lot of the wildlife. And then this is the yellow acacia tree, another classic African species, beautiful, you know, yellowish bark, beautiful trees. So it's kind of, you know, some of the main vegetation that we saw while we were there. We spent about 4 days there going to different areas. So we spent 2 nights in one camp and 2 nights in another camp, and then sort of worked our way through the parks. And then we headed south to the Drakensberg and visited a couple of national parks and left behind all that grand wildlife and was taking to hiking. So we did several hikes. We did 2 hikes in the Royal Natal National Park, which is this area here. And then we did a couple of hikes here in the Melody Drakensberg National Park. One of the things that we did, and you know, probably if you've traveled a lot, you've looked into this too, but this was a recommendation from a friend of ours who had been there a couple years before, is we got basically a pass that got us into all the national parks, which just made it a lot easier. You know, you can purchase it beforehand, you get your pass, you get the letter, and all of that. So we had our card and it just made it easier rather than having to pay all these individual park fees. Sometimes there's not always people there, or, you know, they don't have the change if you have cash. So just having the park pass to get into all these areas made it a lot easier. We stayed in Bergville here, which is kind of the, you know, the little town where everybody stays, and then just did day trips driving up. We found a lovely place to stay. They're sort of like bed and breakfast, but they're a lot bigger. They're like a guest house. You know, people kind of cordon off part of their house and allow their guests to stay, and they provide breakfast, and breakfast was always fabulous. So the first hike we did was the mudslide and cracks hike. And so we got going. This is the view from the parking lot. So you're looking up again, that's the escarpment, that Drakesberg escarpment that's coming down further. And just a view of, you know, hiking along the vegetation, just spectacular, spectacular views. And because it was spring, it was super windy, a lot like our wind has been this year. I mean, we had some incredibly windy days. And my husband, sort of being the adventurer that he is, he liked to pick the hikes that, you know, we had to climb things to access points. So this was, we had to climb up this chain ladder to get up one of the benches to get up here. We were probably hiking again, probably between 6,000 and 8,000 feet. We didn't get up into the really high Drakensberg Mountains, again, because it was early spring and the weather was not very stable. So, you know, we just enjoyed these hikes that are, we had great views of the mountains, but we didn't get up in the super high alpine areas. Another view, and you can see the sort of these grasslands that we were hiking through, just these beautiful open fields that you could see. And then hiking across the plateau, and then we had to hike down another chain ladder in order to get to where the crack is. So this is the crack, kind of giving you a view into the mountains and the view from the crack. The next day we did a hike called the Mushroom Rock. And again, just spectacular hiking and, you know, vistas. Not very buggy, you know, no bugs, which was pretty nice. Warm enough for shorts. And another view through the, and this is the Mushroom Rock, and just kind of hiking along there. And you can see out here, this is a view of the Cathedral Peaks. Again, we didn't get all the way over to those high peaks, but you can see beautiful, beautiful peaks with these lush, lush valleys that just rush down through them. So really gorgeous scenery. From there, we went to the Cape Peninsula, and we spent time at Table Mountain National Park, which was established in 1998 to protect the biodiversity of the Cape region. So Table Mountain is a specific area, but the national park kind of encompasses all of this region in green here, even though Table Mountain is just right up here outside of Cape Town. One of the things it's protecting is the unique fynbos plant assemblages, which consists of shrubland and heathland plants. And although it's the smallest of the 6 plant kingdoms, it's one of the most diverse. And so the fynbos community includes about 9,000 species of plants, of which 6,500 are endemic. And one of the other reasons that they felt compelled to really try to protect this area is because they were having a lot of issues with fire. And when fire was coming through, they weren't getting the protection that they wanted. So by making it a national park, they could develop a fire management plan and protect this really unique biodiversity of this fynbos vegetation. And this is where I was finally going to get to see my African penguin colonies. So we stayed up here in Cape Town, and we just did day trips. And the first penguin colony that we saw here is down here, just outside of Simonstown. So that area is called the Boulders, and it's home to the African penguin. And you always got to take pictures of the fun signs. You don't want to be squishing any penguins on your way out. But one of the things that was unique about this is the penguin colonies have only been there since the mid-'80s. They kind of colonized the mainland. They were mostly out on some islands in the bay, in False Bay out there. And, a couple of pair just started coming into the mainland and sort of liked it, I guess. And this area, you can't tell from these pictures, but this area is in a neighborhood. It's like being in Florida on the coast. It's a residential area. But slowly the local residents kind of took to the colonies. It developed tourism. This is an area that's highly visited, so it's really well designed to handle a lot of people. They have all these boardwalks that go through the beach areas where people can overlook the penguin colonies and not disturb the penguins. Obviously, they don't like you to go right up to them. They are protected. The one thing about being there when we were there in November is that they were molting. And so they don't swim and they don't eat during their molt period. But what they do is they congregate on shore. So you get lots of sightings of penguins. They just look really kind of frumpy because they're molting. But they had their young, and they're in, dense colonies that they're easy to observe and watch. And, I just find penguins really, really fascinating. And I probably took hundreds of pictures of these penguins, but it was a pretty amazing experience. One of the things that they've done is build them homes on the mainland. So these are their little huts. So it protects them from predation and gives them a place to, rear their young. They're well protected. They've also stopped fishing in the bay for their main food sources. So the colony has actually done quite well, although it's still considered an endangered, I think a vulnerable, from the language, a vulnerable species. But they're doing really well. They're pretty well protected from predation here. They have good food sources. So they're doing reasonably well. I'm not sure, since we've been gone, you've probably heard on the news that they've had tremendous droughts in the Cape Town, area. So I'm not sure how that affects these colonies. I'm sure climate change is taking its toll down there. From there, we went to the Cape of Good Hope. And as we learned, I had always thought that it was the southernmost tip of the African continent, but it technically is not. The actual most southern tip is about 120 miles further east. This cape sort of jets out a little bit further to the west. So, from a latitude standpoint, it's not as far south, but it's pretty close and it was good enough for me. we were fortunate to have just a spectacular day for this drive, because this is a drive you want to see in really good weather. Also, a lot of the fynbos vegetation, you could see they have these signs that kind of tell you about what the different plants are, you know, why they're important and that kind of stuff. So that was really interesting. This is one of the plants. You know, they have really interesting looking features. And you can kind of see that sort of heath shrub look as you're hiking through. And you know, just lots and lots and lots of different species all kind of nestled in together in this vegetation type. Really, really spectacular. So the Cape of Good Hope is really a spectacular coastline. Just really, really beautiful, steep coastline that you can see. And in those rocky areas is where the African cormorant nests. You know, typically we see cormorants, you know, out sort of with their wings exposed, just trying to dry themselves out because they don't have as much oil as other pelagic birds. But you don't really see them nesting because they tend to nest in these really hard to get to areas. So it was pretty exciting to be able to, you know, see their colonies up close and watch them do their little thing. One of the other things on one side of this beach, you can hike down. They have this beautiful boardwalk that takes you down to this beautiful white, spectacular sandy beach. It's just absolutely gorgeous. Although it looks really inviting to swim, it was still spring. The water was freezing. And because this is a place where you've got different currents coming in, the undertow is pretty severe from what we hear. So we did not swim. We waited, but we didn't swim. It wasn't nearly warm enough to swim, but it was really just a spectacular beach. And there weren't a lot of people, you know, down there. So it was like you had the beach to yourself. So it was pretty spectacular. From there, up around Cape Town, there's also several places to check out. So this is called Lion's Head. This is this big feature that you can climb also through the fynbos vegetation. And you get great views from there. So this is the view of the road. This was the drive that kind of went up this spine to the trailhead, and then we climbed from there, and then you can see kind of a part of Cape Town here. And also up there, you could see the rock hyrax. Interestingly enough, which, you know, when I learned this in college, it was just sort of mind-blowing to me, but the hyrax is the closest living relative to the elephant, believe it or not. They are both considered ungulates, but why they're the most closely related is because they broke off from the ungulate species pretty early on in the evolutionary chain. So these guys broke off way before many of the other ungulate species that I showed you. So this is what this little guy looks like. Kind of looks like a marmot, sort of, it captures the same, it sort of lives in the same type of environment as marmots do, and they're pretty cute. From there, we hiked up Table Mountain, which is also another big feature, much higher. And Table Mountain was established in 1998 was when the park came, but the Table Mountain Plateau itself extends about 2 miles across. So it's just this huge plateau that rises above Cape Town. And it's accessed by this steep climb. You can see they've cut steps into the rock so that you can get up. And so we went up. It was kind of a misty day. We were glad to have the day before to be at the Cape of Good Hope, but we were hoping for enough good weather to be able to do this hike. So we started the climb, and you get, you know, again, spectacular views down into Cape Town. And this is what it looks like up on the top. And we were kind of in and out of the clouds. And like many, you know, mountain areas, a lot of orographic effects, because in this case, you're surrounded by water. So it's often misty, cloudy, foggy up here. We were fortunate enough to get a relatively good day where we could see out and still have some really nice views. The high point is called McClure's Beacon. And this was built in 1865 as a place to do triangulation for getting references on different features around the area. So that's still there. And you also get great views. This is Lion Head, that feature that we had climbed the day before. This is Robben Island, where Mandela and many others were imprisoned for many years. It was an area that we had hoped to visit, but it was so windy while we were there, and you can see all the whitecaps. I get super seasick, and this is a fairly long boat ride. It's close to 2 hours. So it's a really long day. And because I get so seasick, we just opted not to go out there. I was kind of disappointed because it was someplace I really wanted to go. They do tours. They're all day. It's a really long day. It's like a 10-hour day. So it's a pretty long commitment. But, you know, if we ever get back, it would be someplace else to try to get to. But it was neat to see it. I'm glad it wasn't totally fogged in. Most people who climb Table Mountain take the gondola down, and that's exactly what we did. It's a super steep drop off. As you can, you see, you come out of this little entry here where they load you up on the gondola, and you just drop off this thing, and then you kind of come down. It was pretty fun. It's probably a 7 or 8 minute ride. It goes really, really fast. But we were pretty blessed that day. You know, we had sun and mist and rain, and we got out of the gondola and headed to our car, and the skies just absolutely opened. So we were so lucky to have had a relatively good day and not get totally rained on until we got back to the car. So we were pretty excited. So that's pretty much the end. We spent a little bit more time in a few other areas, but that is our trip kind of in a nutshell. You know, what we learned while we were there. You know, South Africa is a huge country. It's got a rich culture, sort of a tumultuous history. It has fascinating anthropology, lots of other things that we had hoped to go back and explore some of those other aspects of the country. And it has not happened yet. It's not completely out of the realm of possibilities. But that was our initial tour over there. So if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer, and that's pretty much it.
All right. Oops.